Dr. Deutch, thank you very much, not only for being here today and for providing us with some interesting reading prior to this, but also for your many, many years of government service to your country. As I explained to Dr. Schlesinger earlier, we're trying to work within our mandate and trying to figure out, looking at existing structures, what, if anything, we should recommend by way of change. It's clear that the system certainly can stand scrutiny. The real question is whether changes should be made. We don't want to recommend change for change's sake, obviously, and we certainly want to get it right, but by the same token, I don't think anybody is served if we recommend something that's purely aspirational but can't effectively solve whatever problems exist. You've given us a very, very serious and well thought through proposal, and I know we're appreciative, and please don't misunderstand if I ask questions that seem like I don't necessarily agree with it. I'm trying to make sure I understand the facets of it, and I'm sure my fellow commissioners will have the same goal. But the first thing I'd like to discuss with you is in February of 1992, the chairman of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees held a press conference and announced their plans. They were going to create a Director of National Intelligence. And according to the legislation they then introduced, the Director of National Intelligence would have complete control over the U.S. intelligence community, including the management and of assets owned and operated by the Defense Department, but all of the assets. And they argued that a DNI was badly needed because the intelligence community had grown into an empire without an emperor, so to speak. And responsibility was decentralized. Money was being wasted on duplicative programs. There were turf battles among agencies. A little legal authority to guide U.S. intelligence operation activities. I know this sounds all very familiar to all of us now, but this was 10, 11 years ago. And they announced that this was going to be a czar with teeth. Dave McCurdy was pushing this was the czar with teeth. And he's going to be a czar with troops and forces and budgets. And obviously the reaction to the legislation was relatively swift and overwhelmingly negative. And I know you're now familiar with the recommendations of the joint inquiry, which again came out 10 years later and concerned and recommended a Director of National Intelligence. And I have a quote here. This was to be the principal advisor to the President of Intelligence and, quote, have the full range of management, budget, and personnel responsibilities needed to make the entire U.S. intelligence community operate as a coherent whole, end of quote. And they recommended that that position be cabinet level, as you know, and that no person simultaneously serve as Director of National Intelligence and Director of CIA. Your proposal suggests that you keep the Director of CIA, Director of Central Intelligence, as the head of the intelligence community, and that you establish, as I understand it, the Domestic Intelligence Service under that director's leadership. And I guess I have two threshold questions before we get to specifics. And one on this, why do you believe that we should keep a director of Central Intelligence as the head of the intelligence community, as opposed to creating a cabinet level or the DNI with some specificity? And the second question is, why wouldn't both proposals, yours, which modifies the DNI, suffer the same fate in Congress as it did 11 years ago?
Mr. Fielding, the first point is words. Whether you call it a Director of National Intelligence or Director of Central Intelligence, to me is not material. What is material is the description of the authorities and responsibilities that that person will have. If you at the last moment want to for basically cosmetic reasons, change DCI to DNI, I think that's, that is a question of cosmetics. The question is, what is the authority and the responsibilities of the individual? There have been a lot of past studies and people who have recommended creation of greater authorities under the DCI or DNI, as you've mentioned in your comments, and I'm here doing it again today. However, with a little bit more precision, in the sense that I only suggest executive authority for the DCI over the Central Intelligence Agency and the Domestic Intelligence Service. I do not suggest executive authority over the defense agencies. I think that must remain with the Secretary of Defense, and the best balance can be struck by having the resource planning responsibility given to the DCI, but not the day-to-day management. That is a question of my experience as Deputy Secretary of Defense, as well as DCI, how that balance can best be struck. Would Congress approve such a proposal after the very strong endorsement of this commission? Let me say that everyone here is better able to estimate that possibility than I am. I'm, after all, a chemistry professor from MIT. But let me tell you something. I think it's the right thing to do. And it reminds me very much of the debates that went on prior to the formation of a Secretary of Defense. Could it be that a Secretary of Defense could balance being Secretary of War, Secretary of Navy, later Secretary of the Air Force? And it took a long time, and there were still, or occasionally, tensions and struggles. But inevitably, that's where time's arrow is going. And that's really what I'm saying here.
Thank you. I mean, I want to follow up on that just for a second, too, because you've got unique background to help us. You were Director of Central Intelligence, and you were Deputy Secretary of Defense. So you know, if you will, from both sides of that issue when there is an issue of who's in charge. And you suggest the Director not manage the day-to-day operations of agency activities, as I understand it.
Yes, sir. In the Defense Department.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm sorry. But I guess if they're an integral part of military operations, that's the need for that. But won't such a structure as that just lead to an overlap of duties between the Defense Department and the Director, and perhaps confusion as to lines of jurisdiction, and who's going to be the arbiter of these disputes, so to speak? I mean, are we creating an absolute mess on our hands?
Well, first of all, I think we do have an absolute mess on our hands now.
Well,
and the American people are at risk because of it.
Right.
But let me say to you, you can't do this with complete clarity. There are going to be lots of places where it's blurred, and you must have a cooperative relationship between the Secretary and the Director of Central Intelligence. I believe that had I not been Deputy Secretary of Defense and had my secretary in the office, Bill Perry, my job would have gone from being impossible to truly impossible. And so I do think that there is going to be some mess there. And I can point out to you in great detail where it could occur. Dual budget processes, which kind of exist now, and that cannot be allowed to happen. But directionally, it's the right way to go. If you want to make better integration of different intelligence collection, especially from the NSA and the Directorate of Operations in these matters, especially when it may deal with information on U.S. persons, this has to be done.
Well, harking back to your experience as DCI, you obviously had some concerns as to the ambit of your authority and your control. And I'm making that assumption. And if that be true, will this correct those problems that you had from the point of view of the DCI.
Let me divide it into two pieces. First of all, with respect to the Department of Defense, I personally did not have this problem because I went day one from having done the defense allocation issue on one side to the other side, so I personally did not have this difficulty. My predecessor had this difficulty with me, and I believe subsequently my successors have had this difficulty with others, but I did not have it because I came from being Deputy Secretary of Defense. With the FBI, the issue was entirely different. And while a lot of progress has been made, a lot of progress since the time of John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover, there still are tremendous difficulties. And if it had not been in the case of counterintelligence, with Louis Freeh and myself and my deputy taking an immediate interest, we would have had serious problems. And I think that regardless of the good intentions of many, many people in both those strong and important organizations, it's just set up wrong. And you can't make it right by telling them cooperate more.
Thank you, Jim.
Commissioner Gorelick.
Dr. Deutch, I want to echo Fred Fielding's comments of appreciation for the time and energy that you put into this. You have given us, in your testimony and in your written statement, really a very rich and thoughtful product, and I hope we'll have some time beyond the limited hour that we have today to benefit from your views and, as Fred pointed out, your unique experience. I'd like to ask you some questions about focusing on the domestic side. And first, to seek a very clear statement from you with regard to your proposal. I take it that you would not change in any way the constitutional or statutory protections of rights that American citizens currently have with regard to the investigative techniques that may be used against them or about them or in relation to them. Is that correct?
I certainly am not proposing that here today. I am suggesting that whatever balance is struck, the arrangement that I suggest puts the Department of Justice in a better position to assure that that set of rules is followed than the current arrangement.
And is that because you believe that the Department of Justice is now somewhat conflicted in that regard?
I think Department of Justice is tremendously conflicted between three hugely important and valued goals. Goal one is to defend Americans. Goal two is to bring people to justice. And goal three is to protect the rights of Americans. And I think that is a very tough set of strains to resolve when you're working on databases which contain information about American citizens.
So you would give the Department of Justice sort of policy oversight responsibility for the domestic collection capacities of this new DIS?
The word policy troubles me there, Counselor. I would say not only would they set the policy, they would also have the responsibility to making sure enforcing that it was followed. So they would have, a direct hand in determining that the rules of the game with regard to American citizens especially were scrupulously followed by the Domestic Intelligence Service.
Now, you say that you reject the notion of sort of tinkering at the edges, working with what we've got, is the way you put it. And I'd like to turn your attention to the discussion of the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, which, as you note, it calls itself a joint venture. It's supposed to fully integrate information, whether gathered at home or abroad, but there does not appear to be one person or one entity in charge of it. In your view, what are its limitations? Because this is the place where the intelligence is supposed to come together in the manner that you suggest would be possible under your new system. And could, though, whatever shortcomings there may be overcome short of the organizational changes that you propose?
Let me first of all say that I have not had the occasion to know how the new Threat Integration Center Terrorist Threat Integration Center is operating and what the rules of the game are. So what I'll have to do in answering this question is to ask you certain questions. I would ask, does the head of that TTIC have the right to reassign people to different jobs and call in from the FBI or call in from the NSA? I need 10 more analysts, bring them here tomorrow morning.
No.
Sorry? I didn't hear you.
Let's assume the answer is no, but
Let's
why
assume
don't you
the answer is
continue
no.
with your rhetorical questions?
Does the director, who's actually an excellent individual, the person who's the head of this, does that person, can he pick up the phone and say, I want you to shift $10 million from this activity to this next activity? It's a reprogramming. We'll have to inform Congress, but I want to do that right now, and the director supports this. No. Does the director of this agency have the ability to say, we got to think about this over the long term? The way you get good intelligence is to follow a target for a long time. This idea that you just could drop in one day and collect a lot of good agents is wrong. You really have to pursue a target for a long period of time. That's when you really develop good sources and understand what you're dealing with. So we want to develop a collection strategy over several years in a certain region of the world. Does the director of this center have the ability to set such a plan for several years and make it stick with the different agencies? That's another question I would ask. I don't think you can fix that around the edges.
At our very first hearing, I examined the chairs and ranking members of the intelligence committees on one of the subjects that you addressed, which is whether they did or whether even under the current construct they could perform effective oversight of the intelligence community. One of the advantages, I presume, of this organizational structure is that there would be oversight across the board throughout the intelligence communities. Their response roughly was, we can review budget items line by line, but we don't have effective means to look across the intelligence community to match up the threat with the capacity that is supposed to address that threat. You have been overseen by the committees that oversee defense and the committees that oversee intelligence. And having been overseen by two of the three committees, the other relevant committee being judiciary, what are the upsides, if you can identify them, of the shift that you propose from an oversight point of view?
If I were able to see this realignment take place, I would suggest that you would have a separate budget category in the defense accounts, the national security accounts, the 050 accounts, just like we do today, for example, for atomic energy defense activities. I would set one up for the intelligence activities, which included NFIP, JMIP, and Tierra, an associated budget for the, and I would create that as a separate budget category in the overall national security budget, 050 accounts. I believe that would eventually lead Congress to establish a single committee to follow those set of functions. If you could have a single authorizing committee, you would do much, much better with respect, in my judgment, I think, to congressional support and knowledge, informed judgment about these activities. So I think that this naturally leads to a single congressional committee oversight, and one which would be better informed and basically more supportive of intelligence activities.
Thank you for that response. I have one last question. I was following you all the way through your presentation, where the thrust of it was we need to give responsibility and authority to the same person. And we need to hold them accountable because we've given that person, whether it's the DCI or whether it's the DNI, authority over budgets and resources and programmatic efforts. With regard to the Defense Department, you say, let's keep the executive authority over there because they have operational capacity that is well placed there. Nevertheless, you say, let us give this authority to this DCI or the DNI, but the Secretary of Defense has to concur. Now, concur in the exercise of the authority by this DCI or DNI. Now, in my experience, when the Secretary of Defense, given his powerful position in the cabinet, given his stature, given the resources that he has at his disposal, has to concur in anything, that's the end of the story. That concurrence becomes all the power that is needed to maintain the current status quo. So I will ask you, having sat in both places, with all of the honesty you are capable of mustering in a public setting, to tell us whether the concurrence that you suggest undermines the thoughtful proposal you put on the table.
I may need help on this, Mr. Chairman. You, of course, have raised a very excellent point here, but I want to make really two remarks about it. The first is, I did not say that the executive authority lay with the Secretary of Defense for these defense agencies. I said the day-to-day management authority. And I would say the principal planning and resource allocation authority for these agencies lies with the Director of Central Intelligence. That's different. And I don't want to see a parallel structure run by the financial side of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, redo all the budget analysis to get into the kinds of bureaucratic problems that Mr. Fielding also alluded to. Basically, in my heart, I don't think you can tell the Secretary of Defense, use these agencies for combat support and to support troops that are deployed abroad, and not have the Secretary of Defense happy with that, with what the program is. There's also an element of trying to keep Mr. Fielding on my side by saying, without this proposal of the Secretary of Defense having concurrence at the last analysis, this proposal goes nowhere. It goes nowhere. You must give the Secretary of Defense that last, as I can tell you by speaking with several of them. Without that, you can't possibly get the additional oversight, the additional authorities within the Director of Central Intelligence. So there is an element of it that says this is the best way of keeping the legitimate military concerns on board. So that's why I came out of that way.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Fielding.
One follow-up question on our analysis. It's been suggested, it has been suggested that we also consider a structure similar to MI5. I would appreciate any comments you could give us and your thoughts on that as we look at this whole structural issue.
Well, I know the MI5 very well and its operation. The MI5, as you know, reports to the Home Office. So presumably the comparable suggestion here would be to put the Domestic Intelligence Service in the Department of Homeland Security. And that, it seems to me, goes in the wrong direction because it fragments two groups into three. On the other hand, I believe that the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security has a tremendously important role to play in intelligence analysis, because remember, the Domestic Intelligence Service is principally concerned with collection activities. So the Department of Homeland Security has a tremendously important role to play in intelligence analysis and analyzing information from all sources, just as the Department of State does today or the Department of Defense does today. And so the intelligence community has the Secretary of Homeland Security is a principal customer, but I do not believe that you should establish a collection agency away from these others. I think it's going in exactly the wrong direction.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, sir.
We appreciate your time today. You've talked a lot about the relationship between the DCI and the SecDef, the Secretary of Defense. I'm more interested, given the fact that you've given that a lot of thought and a lot of time today, and our commissioners have zeroed in on that. I'm more interested in coming back to some of the mandate that we have on this 9/11 Commission, both at what happened on 9/11 and prior to it, and the relationship between the DCI and the National Security Advisor. You were a DCI in 1995 and 1996. There were, in the 1997, 1998 time period, there were a couple presidential decision directives that Mr. Steinberg talks about in his open testimony, that one created the position of a coordinator for national terrorism, another set forth, as Mr. Steinberg's open testimony talks about, set forth ways to protect the critical infrastructure in the United States of America. Given that this commission is supposed to look at not just the technical failures in the intelligence community, and the joint inquiry found several and numerous failures, you said we're at a crisis position with respect to the intelligence community. We're also supposed to look at policy, and were there policy failures? Let me put this question directly to you. Who within the government is responsible for enforcing a presidential decision directive? Is it the DCI? Is it the National Security Advisor? Is it both? And how do we improve this nexus and this relationship in the future so that we can formulate policy to react to these transnational threats directly against the people and the interests of the United States of America, and formulate effective policy through the venues of government? How would you directly answer that question?
Congressman, I would say the National Security Advisor is responsible for that in the national security area, absolutely. That's certainly the way it was in my time, and there was never any difficulty in my experience in either Defense Department or in the intelligence community. On the other hand, in law enforcement, you have a much more complex question. If you have the National Security Advisor breeze in and say, please, let's do this with respect to some colorable law enforcement activity, you may end up with a huge problem on your hands. And indeed, there were plenty of occasions where that came up in domestic and international matters, where the ability to enforce executive branch views on the law enforcement community came to quite a set of loggerheads. And so I would say to you, it's quite clear in the national security area, a little less clear to me about how you do it when it's involved in law enforcement.
And along those lines, on enforcement of PDDs by the National Security Advisor, given your time there, do you think that those were adequately, was there that adequate enforcement at that time? Was there an aggressive tendency to go back to the agencies and see that they enforced that new PDD?
The PDDs you mentioned, the two you mentioned, occurred after my time.
They occurred in 98, 97, 98. You were there in 95, 96.
Right, I can't comment on that. I will tell you that we had many struggles about infrastructure protection. That's another very complicated subject. And also there, regarding infrastructure protection as a law enforcement matter, is, in my mind, as opposed to a national security matter, separate problem. Related but separate problem, was not resolved happily in any way, but also didn't lead to a PDD. In other words, because it wasn't resolvable, the president didn't promulgate a decision memorandum on it because it wasn't resolved, and it still, I think, has its problems. Infrastructure protection.
Two of the top three recommendations made by the joint inquiry were regarding the structure and the performance of the National Security Council. The first one you've addressed significantly today, the DNI. Number 2 and number 3 address the National Security Council. Do you have specific recommendations as to how we better structure the National Security Council in relation to the current ongoing threat that we have?
I do not. I did not find in my time that the National Security Council was part of the problem of anything. So I do not have a specific recommendation on that. And a little bit to echo my boss, Jim Schlesinger, or prior boss, Jim Schlesinger, I'm not sure how much you really want the White House to get into the management of these kinds of issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cleveland.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, this is such a clear and cogent and well thought out proposal. I fear for your future in the federal government.
You don't have to fear for it, sir.
Let me just say, Secretary Schlesinger mentioned something that piqued my interest. He mentioned the phrase turning point of history or turning points of history, and yet our desire to have a coherent picture about future developments. As a history guy, I'm fascinated with one of the Winston Churchill quotes that how do you know where you're going unless you know where you've been? One of the things that's been fascinating to me was looking at a little bit about where we've been. When was the last attack on this country? It was Pearl Harbor, and my father was stationed at Pearl Harbor after the attack. So I've been fascinated with that period of our history. It does seem that right after Pearl Harbor, there was an immediate critique that it was an intelligence failure, that information was stovepiped, not disseminated, and certainly not available in a clear picture to decision makers. If that all sounds familiar, that was the conclusion right after 1941. And about 4 commissions went into this in depth over a period of about 4 or 5 years. You mentioned that this sounds a little bit today like the debate about creating the Secretary of Defense. Well, that whole structure apparently came about in 1947, the Defense Reorganization Act, which, among other things, not only created the Secretary of Defense, but they created the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And one of the things that was fascinating to me, too, was your testimony that back in those days, in the days of the Cold War, there were bright lines. There was a line, there was a barrier about where our power ended and the Soviet power began. The Berlin Wall, the various lines along the 100 divisions behind the Warsaw Pact and so forth. Those bright lines are gone now. We're in another world, and I think that's what you're at. Doesn't it seem to you that in the wake of the 9/11 attack, we're at another one of those turning points in history where we have to adapt and adjust, particularly in terms of the way we read the tea leaves and making those estimates of where the tea leaves carry us to the decision makers? I think your chart moves us in that direction. And I think you're right. Doing nothing maintains the current mess. One of the things I always noticed was being on the Armed Services Committee for 6 years here in the Senate was that the intelligence community was always referred to as the intelligence community. I always tried to find out who was accountable. In many ways, more than 12 different agencies under 6 different cabinet officers were part of the intelligence community, but who was accountable? And in the intelligence failure of 9/11, I've been trying to find out who is accountable. Well, and that this government did have a lot of information, but it wasn't shared. The tea leaves weren't looked at appropriately, and obviously not enough to get to the decision makers. So I agree with you. We got to adjust to this turning point in history to a new kind of threat, and that is the terrorist threat that doesn't acknowledge bright lines. They don't acknowledge the bright line between domestic and foreign intelligence. They hit the seams, so to speak. And so I'd just like for you to elaborate a little bit more maybe on the history that you are aware of, maybe in the former discussion about creating a new organization to connect the dots back in those days of 1947 in the wake of Pearl Harbor and World War II, and what we needed in terms of centralizing intelligence. Can you share a little bit, and is some of that information relevant to us now?
Senator, let me give you a very brief answer because I know our time is short here, but Roberta Wohlstetter wrote a book on the failure, intelligence failure of Pearl Harbor, which is stuck in my mind because it explains not only Pearl Harbor, it explains lots of these intelligence failures. And when I say intelligence failures, I don't mean to disparage the community, and certainly not the people who work in it. But a successful intelligence requires 3 steps: collection of information, analysis of that information, and then transmission to a policymaker who is willing to listen. And when you look in detail at these events, always there's something which has gone wrong in part of those 3 steps. Sometimes the policymaker is not willing to listen, and that was in part the problem in Pearl Harbor, military commanders there and here. Often it is inadequate analysis, and it always is better to have more information rather than less. But the heart of the matter is to have a set of dedicated and capable intelligence analysts who have access to all available information and who can objectively give you their unvarnished best estimate. It doesn't guarantee you successful intelligence because the policymaker may still not listen. But you have to have the elements: collect the information, do fabulous analysis, and have a policymaker who's willing to listen.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. That's a powerful statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm curious if the recommendations that you're now proposing had been in effect some years ago. Do you think it would have changed what happened on 9/11?
Governor, I can't answer a question like that. It is too hypothetical for me.
Yeah.
I think it is a catastrophe what happened to this country, and I think it signals the need to do something. But I could not possibly give you a fair answer to that question.
Okay, I understand that. Yeah, yes, Ms. Slade, and then Commissioner Lehman.
Dr. Deutch, as fascinating as this is, it reminds me, you mentioned a book about Pearl Harbor. It reminds me of that wonderful title of a tragedy in World War II, A Bridge Too Far. And so my question to you is, if you took out the blue lines and didn't get yourself into a fight with the Secretary of Defense, and perhaps only had what you have here as CIA and the Domestic Intelligence Service under a single head, would that be a significant improvement over the present situation?
Senator, it would be a significant improvement. And I'm well aware that this is a bridge too far. My effort was to try and clearly describe what I thought the necessary changes were. But you are quite right. If you if you leave the defense stuff out, you've got lots of big things you've given up, especially the connection between human intelligence collection and signals intelligence collection. It would be a big step, but I don't think it would be a sufficient step.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary Lehman.
Dr. Deutch, one of the critiques of the current intelligence community is that as a result of the tremendous technical breakthroughs of the 60s, 70s, and then the political assaults of the Pike Committee and the Church Committee during on the intelligence community as a whole, that this drove a total domination and the creation of a completely technical culture in the intelligence community. If it wasn't measurable, if it wasn't countable, then it was dismissed as anecdotal, and this has been applied even to subjective analysis, having to have a mathematical probability assigned to it before it could be passed forward. Given that not much in the war on terror, not much of the enemy target base is countable, do we have too much investment both in hardware and in culture in the technical dimension of intelligence today?
Mr. Secretary, it's a very good question. I would first of all argue that if you look in detail at even the most far-reaching human collection possibility you might think of, that there are elements of technical intelligence which can support that and make it more effective. So first of all, I sort of resist saying we have human intelligence and then we have this, satellites, and they're kind of disconnected. I think that, in fact, if you look in detail, you can see occasions where if you work them closely together, and I think that's happening more and more, that it's really a very good thing. There's no question that human intelligence capability, especially in the CIA, suffered dramatically in the early 90s. No question about it, including during my time. But the overwhelming reason for that fact, Mr. Secretary, had nothing to do with technical or non-technical. It had to do with one thing, and that was Aldrich Ames. If you go back to 1991, in this town, 1992, 93, the one thing which was quite clear was what had happened to Soviet and Russian penetration of our intelligence services and the FBI. And so if you say to me, why was there such, declining budgets, yes, all these other things, everything would have been okay if it hadn't been for Aldrich Ames. I believe that the history of the Directorate of Operations would have been much smoother sailing. And I'm very, very pleased that my deputy, who is now director, has managed to build up and strengthen that Directorate of Operations. But please, when you describe what has been the great decline and then coming back up of the Director of Operations, remember, it was Aldrich Ames that caused the problem, not anything else.
Thank you.
Last question from Commissioner Benvenisti.
Dr. Deutch, I am intrigued with something which was mentioned in your prepared remarks with respect to recruitment of foreign assets. I sit on another commission which is charged with declassifying millions of pages of documents from the post-World War II and post-World War II period. And the focus there is on... I'm sorry. Did you hear the...
I heard, yes, sir.
Okay. The focus there is on the recruitment of those with Nazi war crimes histories in the post-World War II period as a matter of expediency to get up and running against the Soviet threat. And I notice that you have discussed the question, which has been raised broadly in the post-9/11 period, of whether restrictions on recruitment of foreign assets who have histories of crimes against humanity make sense to continue in the post-9/11 period. And having seen the result of the compromising of the West German intelligence organization from the recruitment of those with that kind of tainted past, and noticing your remarks on the subject, I wonder if you could elaborate.
Could you tell me where these remarks are, Mr. Benveniste?
This would be on page 3 of 5.
3?
In an article which you wrote.
Oh, I see. It's not my testimony.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was in the materials which our very diligent staff had collected. It was an article which you wrote with Jeffrey Smith in Foreign Policy magazine fairly recently.
I don't have the article in front of me. If you read that article with care, it also has a proposal similar to this, but less. Thank you. But let me just say that you absolutely have to recruit individuals with the worst kind of backgrounds, the worst kinds of criminal and humanitarian deficiencies. You absolutely have to do that. The question is the procedure that is used for a case officer in the field to recruit such individuals. But let there be no doubt about it, we can have no barriers on the kind of character, criminal record, or personality of agents that our case officers try to recruit in the field. That is essential. How they get approval for that is what is at issue, I think, in the article that you referred to. And it is my judgment that case officers in the field are best protected and best able to take those risks if there's a procedure that validates their decision to recruit a bad person. But let me be clear about it so there's not a moment of doubt. If you cannot, you must be able to recruit the very worst kinds of people in order to pursue our national interest.
Dr. Deutch, thank you very, very much.